Welcome back to David Roman, the channel where we strip away the noise and get straight to what's actually happening on the ground, in the war rooms, and inside the economic machinery of nations at war. If you're new here, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now, because the kind of analysis we do on this channel, the kind that actually connects the dots, takes real time to build, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Seriously, just tap it. It helps YouTube push this content to more people who deserve to understand what's really going on. Now, let's get into it. Pokrovsk. Before the war, most people outside eastern Ukraine had never heard of it. It was a modest industrial city in Donetsk Oblast with a pre-war population of around 60,000 people. Quiet, functional, the kind of place that shows up on maps but rarely in headlines. But for nearly 2 years, Pokrovsk became one of the most contested pieces of ground on the entire Eastern European front. From early 2024 until late 2025, Russian forces poured men, armor, artillery, and drones into the fight for this city. The advance was painfully slow, and I mean that literally. Progress wasn't measured in kilometers, it was measured in meters, sometimes dozens of meters, sometimes fewer. By the time Russian troops finally pushed into the ruins of Pokrovsk in December 2025, the battle had become a symbol of the entire war. Massive effort, enormous losses, and painfully little strategic payoff, because even though the Kremlin declared victory, capturing Pokrovsk didn't deliver the breakthrough Moscow had spent years gambling on. Even after taking the city, Russia couldn't actually do anything meaningful with it, and that's where this story gets fascinating. Here's the thing most coverage gets wrong. Russia taking Pokrovsk wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of Ukraine's most calculated response of the entire war. While Russia was fixated on that single objective, pouring everything into Pokrovsk like it was going to crack the entire front open, Ukraine had its eyes on something else entirely. The plan wasn't to hold Pokrovsk at any cost. The plan was to let Russia drain itself chasing it, then strike everywhere else. Beginning in late December 2025, just as Russia was claiming victory and the Kremlin's propaganda machine was spinning into overdrive, Ukraine started mounting counterattacks designed to exploit exactly how many Russian forces had been tied down in that city. The results were stunning. Ukrainian forces recaptured approximately 115 square miles in under 2 weeks in February 2026, eliminating what amounted to nearly 2 full Russian regiments in the process. Think about that for a moment. Russia spent the better part of 2 years grinding forward at roughly 70 meters, about a 20th of a mile, per day in Pokrovsk. To put that in historical perspective, that is slower than the rate of advance during the Battle of the Somme in World War I, one of the bloodiest military failures in human history, and Russia was moving even slower than that. Meanwhile, Ukraine was recapturing territory at a pace that made those Russian gains look almost comically inadequate. And here's the first question I want you to sit with. Drop your answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to hear your thinking. If Russia had redirected all the resources it burned on Pokrovsk toward a different target along the front, do you think the outcome of this war would look fundamentally different right now? That is a question military analysts are actively debating, and it cuts straight to the heart of Russia's strategic decision-making. Ukraine's approach throughout this period has been described as military whack-a-mole, and honestly, that's one of the more accurate analogies I've heard. As soon as Russia makes a push toward one of the larger settlements in the region, Ukraine creates a counterstrike somewhere else to force a response. It's not just defense, it's a deliberate, active, strategic drain on Russian resources and attention. A perfect example is what happened in Russia's Kursk Oblast, specifically the city of Sudzha. In August 2024, Ukrainian forces seized Sudzha during a surprise cross-border offensive that shocked the Russian military, the Russian public, and the entire international community. Here were Ukrainian soldiers operating not inside Ukraine, but on Russian soil. It exposed just how vulnerable Russia's own border regions had become. Moscow eventually recaptured Sudzha in March 2025 after a major counteroffensive, but the damage had already been done. The episode shattered the narrative that Russia fully controlled its own territory, and crucially, it forced the Kremlin to divert troops away from the Ukrainian front. Every soldier sent to Kursk was a soldier not being sent to Donetsk. According to multiple military analysts and geolocated battlefield data, the Kremlin is not only losing ground in key areas, it's also losing the information war against its own command structure. Field commanders are routinely reporting victories that don't exist to superiors, who then allocate resources based on those fabricated reports. The result is a feedback loop of dysfunction, bad information feeding bad decisions, feeding worse outcomes, all while the official narrative insists everything is going according to plan. Ukraine, by contrast, is operating operating as if it still holds a structural advantage, enough of one to sustain offensive pressure while absorbing Russian attacks. Ukrainian forces are bleeding Russian formations at scale, and every counterattack Ukraine launches is also a political message to the world. The war is not over, the outcome is not settled, and Ukraine's military has not surrendered the initiative. Now, to understand why Pokrovsk mattered so much to Russia, you need to understand what this city actually was before the war. Pokrovsk was one of the critical hubs of Ukraine's Eastern Logistics Network, a rail and road intersection that provided supplies across a significant portion of the Donbas front line. Western analysts, Ukrainian commanders, and Russian planners all understood what taking it would theoretically mean: a chokehold on Ukrainian resupply routes, a potential cascade of pressure on adjacent positions, and a genuine strategic foothold in the region. In short, Pokrovsk was exactly the kind of objective that was supposed to justify every loss Russia absorbed to reach it, but what Russia's military got was a ruin of a city instead. Ukrainian forces had spent years rerouting their logistics, hardening alternative supply corridors, and preparing fallback positions. By the time Russian boots were walking through what remained of Pokrovsk, its strategic value had largely been engineered away. Ukraine had already moved on. The chess piece Russia fought so hard to capture had already been removed from the board. All Ukraine lost was a former logistics hub, emphasis on former, 3 years, hundreds of thousands of men, enormous treasure, all of it expended chasing a target that kept moving, and that might be the single most damning sentence you can write about Russia's entire war effort. By the time they get there, the thing they wanted is already gone. To understand why, you have to look at the broader pattern of attritional warfare that defined 2024 and 2025. On paper, Russia had the advantage. It entered this war with more soldiers, more armored vehicles, and a far larger defense industry capable of producing the artillery ammunition that modern warfare burns through at staggering rates. Russia's ability to simply outshoot its opponents should have been, according to classical military doctrine, a potentially war-ending edge. But those advantages translated into painfully slow progress. By early 2026, Russia had already suffered an estimated 250,000 fatalities, 250,000 dead, and its offensive still produced only marginal gains. For Moscow, that reality carries weight beyond the military. Putin's political identity and his entire justification for power have been built on the promise of a decisive victory. The original objectives: capture of Kiev, dissolution of the Ukrainian government, reabsorption of Ukraine into Russia's sphere of influence, remain unmet. Every day that passes without those goals is a day the narrative frays further, and the harder it becomes to sustain that narrative, the more the Kremlin is forced to celebrate the capture of farmland in rural Donetsk as if it were a strategic masterstroke. And here is where the story pivots from the battlefield to something equally alarming: the infrastructure. Russian Railways, known by its acronym RZHD, is the state-owned monopoly that moves approximately 87% of all Russian cargo. It is the backbone of a country spanning 11 time zones, and by extension, the backbone of Russia's military supply chain. As of early 2026, RZHD is carrying nearly 4 trillion rubles in debt, approximately $52 billion. This is the corporation's biggest crisis in 16 years. The company posted its first net loss in 5 years. Its cash reserves collapsed 12-fold. It has sent workers on unpaid leave, has begun laying off staff, and cut its investment program by a quarter. The Russian government even ordered the emergency sale of a 62-story Moscow skyscraper RZHD had purchased just 2 years earlier, essentially a garage sale to plug financial holes caused by the government's own wartime demands. The cruel irony, the very reason RZHD is collapsing is because it was turned into a war logistics system. Military shipments get priority, commercial cargo gets crowded out, and that commercial cargo is precisely what RZHD needs to service its debt. Freight volumes fell to a 15-year low in 2024, then kept falling. Roughly 200 trains are canceled every single day due to staffing shortages, and the 2026 budget has already been cut 20% versus the prior year. RZHD accounts for 2.5% of Russia's entire GDP. It is too big to fail. Putin knows it, and yet his own policies are the ones destroying it. The supply chain crisis doesn't end at the railways. Russia's civilian aviation sector is collapsing in parallel. Following Western sanctions, Russian airlines were cut off from global supply chains. More than half of Russia's Western-built fleet could be grounded by mid-2026 due to spare parts shortages. Airlines have resorted to cannibalizing functioning aircraft to keep others flying, a practice called parts harvesting that is both dangerous and self-defeating, since every plane dismantled is one that can never be restored. Russia had ambitious plans to replace its Western fleet with domestically produced aircraft. The Kremlin claimed it would add 1,000 aircraft by 2030. The actual result, 5 new aircraft produced across all of 2024 and 2025 combined. The program was quietly shelved mid-2025 and never revisited in state media. Now, if you've been finding this breakdown valuable, and you want to keep following this story as it continues to develop, or this is a natural moment to subscribe to David Roman if you haven't already. This channel covers exactly this. Not just what happened, but why it happened, what it means strategically, and where it's heading. No filler, just the real picture. Here is where the picture gets genuinely alarming on a global scale. According to Estonia's Foreign Intelligence Service, whose annual assessment is considered one of the most reliable open-source analyses of Russian military capability available, Russia produced approximately 7 million artillery shells, mortar rounds, and rockets in 2025 alone. That is more than 17 times the 400,000 rounds it produced in 2021, the year before the invasion. Russia also imported an estimated 5 to 7 million additional rounds from North Korea and Iran since 2023, with North Korean ammunition accounting for roughly half of Russia's artillery expenditure in the second half of 2025. Staggering numbers, but here is what makes them strategically alarming rather than merely impressive. Russia is not spending all of it in Ukraine. The Estonian assessment explicitly notes that Moscow is replenishing strategic reserves depleted in the early years of the war. In other words, Russia is producing ammunition at a rate that exceeds its current combat consumption. It is stockpiling for something beyond the current front. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has stated plainly that Russia produces more ammunition in 3 months than all of NATO produces in an entire year. Germany's Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has described Russia as having fully transitioned to a war economy, geared not just to sustain the Ukraine campaign, but to prepare for what comes after. And when you combine that production surge with the fact that Russia has made essentially no meaningful territorial progress despite this ammunition advantage, a troubling question demands an answer. If you're producing at those levels and still stagnating, where is all of that firepower actually going? One explanation is waste and corruption. Logistical failures, meaning supplies, never reach the front effectively. But the Estonian intelligence service offers a more alarming interpretation. Russia is highly likely preparing for a future conflict even while its war against Ukraine continues. This is where Russia's strategic picture becomes genuinely contradictory. The Kremlin is running its defense industry at wartime capacity and stockpiling ammunition for something larger. Meanwhile, the economic foundation beneath that war machine is visibly crumbling. Western sanctions have cut Russia off from the technology needed to sustain advanced manufacturing. Russia's GDP growth slowed to an estimated 0.6 to 1% in 2025, down sharply from 4.3% in 2024. The country is locked in a wartime economy with no realistic growth path unless the war ends in its favor. And then there is China, the variable that changes everything. Russia is now deeply dependent on China for semiconductors, industrial inputs, and economic survival. That dependency gives Beijing extraordinary leverage. China dictates the price of Russian oil and gas. That economic leverage has grown into geopolitical influence. China is using Russia as an instrument to chip away at NATO's standing in regions critical to Chinese trade, the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia. In pursuing this war, Putin has transformed Russia into precisely the kind of dependent, subordinate state he claimed he was trying to prevent Ukraine from becoming. This leaves Putin cornered in ways that are dangerous for the broader world. So let's talk about his remaining options, and how dangerous each one actually is. The first option is limited nuclear escalation. The use of a tactical nuclear weapon on Ukrainian territory is no longer as unthinkable as it was in 2022. A small yield device detonated on a military concentration or symbolic target would serve several Kremlin objectives: shatter Western public support for continued involvement, test NATO's red lines, and give Putin a dramatic narrative reset after years of stalemate. But the risks run severe in every direction. A nuclear strike would almost certainly trigger a NATO response capable of destroying significant Russian military assets and collapsing Russia's remaining trade relationships. It would force China into an impossible position. Beijing has publicly opposed nuclear use in Ukraine, and a strike would compel President Xi to either condemn Russia or align with nuclear aggression on the world stage. And most fundamentally, a tactical nuclear strike would not change the arithmetic of the war. Ukraine would either capitulate, unlikely given everything we have seen, or continue fighting with the full moral backing of the entire international community, while Russia stood almost entirely isolated. The second option is deliberate stagnation, freezing the current front lines, reducing operations to a lower intensity, and spending the next several years quietly rebuilding, replenishing ammunition reserves, replacing armored vehicles, positioning for a future offensive at far greater scale than anything attempted so far. This is the scenario Western military planners fear most, precisely because it is the most rational option available to Moscow. A multi-year pause would give Russia time to reconstitute the armored strike force lost in 2022, rebuild artillery reserves, and wait for shifts in Western political will. But it also requires Ukraine to remain static while Russia rebuilds, and Ukraine has shown zero indication of accepting that. Any extended pause would be interpreted by NATO as direct confirmation that a wider war is being prepared, because there is no logical reason to stop a war and immediately ramp up weapons production for that same war unless you plan to restart it at greater scale. And here is the second question I want you to drop in the comments, because this one genuinely matters. Which of these scenarios do you think is most likely? Limited nuclear escalation, deliberate stagnation, and rebuilding, or something else entirely? And does your answer change based on what you expect to happen inside Russia's economy over the next 6 months? The third scenario, and arguably the most likely near-term outcome, is that the war simply continues. Russia keeps launching incremental advances large enough to generate domestic headlines. Ukraine keeps launching counterattacks. If one side reveals a decisive structural weakness, the conflict may resolve in 2026. But it may equally grind on for years, exhausting, costly, and increasingly destabilizing for European security. With each passing month, compounding pressure on Russia's internal systems will intensify. The economic strain, the infrastructure collapse, the demographic toll of hundreds of thousands dead, the continuous erosion of the official narrative, it all accumulates. Systems under this kind of sustained, multi-directional pressure do not remain stable indefinitely. At some point, they reach a breaking point. What that breaking point looks like, whether it comes from the battlefield, the economy, or from inside the Kremlin itself, is the defining question of this war's next chapter. That is what we will be watching, and when that moment comes, David Roman will be right here to break it down with you. If today's analysis added something for you, a new angle, a clearer picture of what is actually at stake, the best thing you can do right now is leave a comment below. Tell me what hit hardest. Tell me where you agree or where you would push back. Every comment you leave signals to the algorithm that serious, substantive content deserves to reach more people. And that matters more than you might think. So talk to me. I read every single one. This is David Roman. Stay sharp, stay informed, and I will see you in the next one.